Charles Turner wasn't always homeless and had once dreamed of living a completely different life. He used to have a beautiful house and a loving wife who was always waiting for him to come home from work. However, everything changed in an instant when Amanda Turner died in a car accident. After his wife's funeral, Charles developed a drinking problem, which eventually caused him to burn down his own house and quit his job. Thus, without even realizing when and how it happened, Charles became homeless. Life on the street was fraught with many dangers, and it was very difficult, but the man didn't seem discouraged since he was an optimist by nature. Over time, he got used to sharing his life with other homeless people, and they started treating him as one of their own. Charles stopped abusing alcohol and was good with technology and electronics. He could easily fix a TV or a radio. Some of the homeless people had those things, and if they were ever broken down, they would always bring them over to Charles to fix. The only thing the man regretted was that old age found him on the street, and not in a warm and comfortable home. But Charles was somewhat fortunate in this regard. A year ago, he came across an abandoned garage and settled down in it with his dog, Lucky. Charles found him in a terrible storm, whimpering by the trash cans when he was just a little puppy. Having decided to keep the puppy, the old man got himself a true friend who accompanied him everywhere. But most of all, Lucky enjoyed spending time in a landfill, because there he could run after the crows and stray cats until he ran out of strength. Since Charles's main source of income was collecting recyclables, he made sure to visit the landfill at least once a week, where he picked up cardboard, bottles, and polyethylene. Much to Lucky's delight, that day was the landfill day. The caretaker of the city landfill already knew Charles well, and seeing him from a distance, waved his hand at him. The old homeless man knew his way around the realm of mountains of garbage and pyramids of household waste, and thus he knew where exactly he needed to look. Charles even made himself a cart from scrap to help him carry around whatever he managed to collect. But before the old man had time to delve into the labyrinth of the city dump, he saw an old sofa upholstered in cracked leather. It didn't look bad, and when Charles spotted it, his eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I need. I've been sleeping on a cot for way too long," the old man whispered, still unable to believe his luck. Having come closer, Charles made sure that the sofa was in good condition and could serve him well. Having loaded it onto his cart, the old man set off on his way back to his garage. Seeing Charles drenched in sweat, the caretaker exclaimed, "Hey, do you need help? It seems way too heavy for you." But the old man only shook his head and quickened his pace. About an hour later, the sofa was already in place in his garage. Putting the cot inside, Charles couldn't be happier about his find. Tired from the road, the old man decided to immediately try out the new sofa and get some rest. However, when Charles lied down and tried to sleep, a tight, bulging lump pushed into his side. The feeling was unpleasant enough to prevent Charles from falling asleep. "What is this?" the old man muttered and got up from the sofa. Trying to smooth out the strange lump, Charles hit it with his hand, but a sharp pain immediately pierced his palm. Blood spattered, and the old man cried out loudly. At that moment, he saw a sharp spring sticking out of the sofa. Lucky, who was fast asleep just a moment ago, jumped up and started growling menacingly, unable to understand what was going on. After bandaging his hand with the handkerchief, Charles kicked the sofa in retaliation and stepped aside. At that moment, one of the sides of the sofa fell off, and some shiny, rounded objects rained down on the floor with a clang. Lucky rushed to the nearest one and nudged it playfully with his paw. Charles knelt down and was stunned by what he saw. There was a pile of gold jewelry sparkling in front of him. Rings, earrings, and brooches attracted the eye, and the old man couldn't stop admiring his treasure. Who would throw away a sofa with such a stash? Or maybe they didn't know about it? The old man whispered. Lucky barked softly and licked the old man on the cheek. The dog didn't understand the value of the jewelry lying on the floor, but he loved his master more than anything in the world. Still undecided as to what to do with the gold, Charles put it in a canvas bag and placed it under the table. Then he put the sofa back together and removed the spring that was sticking out. Well, now you can finally take a rest, especially since you're now rich and all, Charles thought with a smile. But taking a nap wasn't in the cards for him. Before the old man had time to close his eyes, he got a visit from Francis, who volunteered in a center that helped the homeless and people in difficult life situations. The man was a widower who lost his wife to an insidious hereditary disease. Left alone, Francis dedicated his life to doing good and helping others. He came by Charles's garage to give him a shot for his radiculitis and exchange the latest news. Francis enjoyed talking to the old man, whose mind and memory were still sharp as ever. Seeing the new sofa in Charles's garage, the volunteer smiled and commented on the new addition to his home. "Looks good and comfortable, but very old," Francis added, giving Charles a thumbs up. However, the volunteer quickly noticed that something was bothering the old man and immediately asked what it was. "I don't know how to say it. Basically, I found a treasure inside the couch. Well, not a treasure exactly, but someone's stash," Charles answered and took the canvas bag from under the table. Francis was very surprised to see the contents of the bag. "Dear God, that's a lot of jewelry," the volunteer gasped. "Yes, it sure is, and I don't know what to do about it. Should I take it to a pawn shop, or should I try and find out who threw out the sofa?" Charles asked, puzzled. Francis shook his head dubiously and shared his take on the situation. "I don't think you should rush to sell it. Don't forget that you're a homeless man, living in an abandoned garage. They could easily accuse you of having stolen it and take it away. You'd better try to find out something about the former owner of the sofa, and only then deal with the jewelry." Charles looked at Francis and quickly realized that he was right. The next day, the two friends went to the city dump where they talked to the caretaker and several garbage truck drivers. There, Francis and Charles managed to find out that the sofa was brought to the landfill by some old woman who lived on the corner of Park Street. "Well, that's a good start. I think we should pay this woman a visit and ask her about the sofa," Francis suggested on their way back from the landfill. Charles nodded approvingly, but deep down, he was doubtful that some old woman could have so much jewelry. Soon, they were already standing next to the unsightly, dilapidated house, which didn't look like it belonged to a wealthy person. Francis and the old man exchanged confused glances and knocked decisively on the door. A couple of minutes later, they heard the clanging of the rusty lock, and a gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway. She vaguely resembled a witch from the fairy tale about Hansel and Gretel. "What do you want? I don't have any money, so I won't be buying anything from you. Get out of here before I call the police," the old woman said instead of a greeting. Francis was dumbfounded by such insolence, but Charles was already used to being treated like that, so he replied, "We're not trying to sell you anything. We're interested in the sofa that you threw out recently." The old woman grimaced, and her lips stretched into a mean smile. Finally, the woman answered, "Sofa? I didn't need it. It belonged to my niece. I took care of her after my sister died." "And where is your niece now?" Francis couldn't help but ask. The old woman made an annoyed face again and answered with contempt in her voice. "She lives in a hospice now. She hurt her back when she was skating with her fiancé. Now she's wheelchair-bound. Her fiancé dumped her as soon as it happened. And what about me? I'm too old for it. There's nothing I could do to help her. So I moved her to a hospice for disabled people." The old woman's words caused a storm of negative emotions in Francis, which turned out to be very difficult to contain. Understanding what the volunteer was feeling, Charles said goodbye to the old woman and took his friend aside. "How's that even possible? Sending your own niece to live out her life in a hospice?" Francis exclaimed. Charles shook his head, but refrained from further comment. The old man saw too much evil during his life on the street, so it was hard to surprise him anymore. The men quickly found the hospice the old woman mentioned. As a volunteer, Francis knew all such institutions in the city. The old woman's niece turned out to be a very pretty young woman named April. She was about 25 years old. According to the hospice staff, the poor thing sat for hours in her wheelchair, looking out the window where a completely different life was in full swing. Seeing the unkempt old man and the nice middle-aged man in front of her, April raised an eyebrow in surprise. April didn't have any relatives apart from her aunt, Camille, so having people come visit her made the young woman very anxious. But when Frances asked April about the old couch, she sighed in disappointment. "Oh, it was my parents' sofa. My mother passed away and my father died in prison. He robbed a jewelry store many years ago, but he was caught a week later. They never found the jewelry though, so he got a very harsh sentence. And 2 years later, he died of leukemia in the prison hospital. The sofa was important to me as a memory of my parents, but I don't need it anymore. You can see what I've become now," the young woman said with tears in her eyes. Frances exchanged a meaningful look with Charles and realized that the old man was thinking the exact same thing that he was. "My fiancé broke up with me. I didn't want to go skating, but he insisted. Now he's living his life with some new woman, and I have to live out the rest of my life in a hospice for the disabled. I could get surgery, but it costs too much money," April added with a sob. Francis put his arm around the woman's shoulders and tried to calm her down. At this time, Charles tactfully stepped aside and thought for a minute. On the one hand, the old man didn't want to give up his treasure, but he felt very sorry for the young woman who ended up disabled because of her fiancé. Charles had already realized that the jewelry he found in the sofa belonged to April's father, who died in prison. As soon as Francis came over to the old man, Charles told him that he wanted to help the young woman. Tears welled up in the eyes of the volunteer as he realized that Charles was serious about his decision. "God, you've got the biggest heart," Francis exclaimed. He was touched to the core by the old man's decision. Having made up their minds, the two friends took part of the jewelry to a pawn shop and got a large amount for it, which they immediately used to pay for April's surgery. Thanks to the professionalism of the doctors, everything went well, and just 1 month later, the woman was already taking her first steps. Francis stayed by April's side through it all, cheering her on every step of the way. Meanwhile, Charles sold the rest of the jewelry and used the money to buy a house by the lake, where he started living together with April and Francis. Lucky was incredibly happy about this change in their lives and spent his days chasing ducks and frogs by the lake. Lucky now had 2 more owners, who loved the dog as much as Charles did and hoped that he would make a great friend to their baby one day.